A mogu. Da. Pa da, sad sigurno mogu. Mogu ja malo. To je... to je dovoljno. Meni. It's fine. Too much for them, not enough for me. No? Yeah, it's fine. Da. I pakiet točne informacije, ali sad je...
Good morning. How are you today? The second day of the conference. I hope you're cheerful and ready for more lectures. So today's first keynote speaker will be our dear friend, Professor Paul Stubbs, who is originally from Liverpool, but he is living in Croatia for so long that we think of him as our fellow and Croat. He is a sociologist and activist researcher who has lived and worked in Zagreb, as I said, for a very long period, from 1994. I think that maybe some of you haven't been born at that point. So his work focuses on policy translation, international actors in social policy and social development, and the new green left municipalism, and increasingly on the history of Yugoslav socialism, social welfare, and the non-alignment movement. So he is also a senior research fellow in the Institute of Economics in Zagreb. And if you have time after his lecture, you can check his latest book, which was published this year, early in the year, called Socialist Yugoslavia and the Non-Alignment Movement, Social, Cultural, Political, and Economic Imaginaries. So I will, without further speaking and holding up the time, I will give a word to Professor Stubbs, and later on you will have opportunity to ask him a few questions about his lecture. Thank you.
Thanks. Paul is fine. Look, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to do this. I now realize how stupid I was to agree to it. I thought you were my friends. And what you will end up with, I think, is what happens when a sociologist working in an Institute of Economics discovers history. All right, so I'm going to try and keep it to 35 minutes. And the lecture is in 3 parts, really. I want the mood to be Tito lying on the beach in Briuni, but it may be more of a kind of working meeting of the 5. The third part is the one that probably is of most interest to you, and yet it's highly tentative, okay? So part 1 reflects my long-standing concern with the nature and origins of the non-aligned movement, and in particular, the role played in its founding and development by Socialist Yugoslavia. So that book that you were kind enough to mention is the kind of foundation of the first part. Part 2 summarizes work that I'm doing now, a book that I'm writing on the attempt to institutionalize a new international economic order and the role of the non-aligned movement within this in the 1970s. Now, in both of those parts, I'm going to make some passing reference to environmental justice. But it's only when we get to part 3 that I will make political ecology my main focus. And this is the tentative bit, all right? I will look at the stance of Yugoslavia, the Global South, and the role of the UN in the elaboration of environmental concerns in the 1970s, through close attention to the work of 2 figures whose only commonality perhaps is their Yugoslav origins. Right. So, the partnership between socialist Yugoslavia and states in the global south within the non-aligned movement formally began in the summit in Belgrade from the 1st to the 5th of September 1961. Vijay Prashad, in that lovely book, The Darker Nations, his chapter on Belgrade says, Belgrade was the third world's Yalta, all right? And right early in the book, he says, the third world is not a place, it's a project. This is the spirit of what I'm trying to argue here. The non-aligned movement, starting in Belgrade, provides an insight into what I want to term globalization otherwise, because it brought other possibilities and worlds into view than today's neoliberal globalization. I'll say NAM instead of the non-aligned movement so that we get through this quicker. NAM can be regarded as one of a number of what Adam Getachev terms critical, anti-systemic and anti-colonial world-making projects after the Second World War. World-making, right? Offering a form of transnational solidarity whose dominant actors, apart from socialist Yugoslavia, were outside the European space. NAM offered alternatives then, not only to East-West conflicts in the Cold War, but also the hopes of a world emerging from colonial domination of the South by the North. All right? The question of how NAM came into being, and perhaps even more importantly, its significance, is hard to answer. Why was Yugoslavia playing such an important role? Well, some of this derives from the credibility that Yugoslavia had gained from the authentic and victorious anti-fascist struggle during the Second World War, a struggle which now in contemporary Croatia is being systematically and violently erased and forgotten. But the break with Stalin in 1948, followed by Yugoslavia's failure to secure meaningful cooperation with other Balkan states, meant that socialist Yugoslavia had to look elsewhere to prevent its total isolation politically and economically. It turned to countries in the global south, emerging from colonial rule for a new alliance. And this was an idea that you would be aligned neither with the Soviet Union nor with the capitalist United States. And this was a gradual process of building that relationship with the global south. Yugoslav President Tito's radical defense of the principle of self-determination, which he didn't invent, of course, it comes from earlier and from Nehru, and his critique of an understanding of world revolution based on, this is a quote from one of his speeches, unconditional subordination of small socialist countries to one large socialist country, also resonated with many decolonial states, unwilling to swap colonial rule for the undue influence of one or other power bloc. Okay? The Yugoslavs, I think, grasped the significance of the doubling in the number of member states of the UN between 1945, where there were 53 member states, and 1960, where there were 99 member states, so the newly independent decolonial states, for a new framework of global governance. Someone might want to have a question about the UN, because the non-aligned movement was constructively critical and wanted UN reform, which, had it happened, may have been a different story. These states, of course, mobilized long before Belgrade. In April 1955, the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian States took place, but attempts to organize a follow-up to Bandung never happened, not least because of a continuing border dispute between China and India. This undoubtedly contributed to the emergence of the non-aligned states, although the nature of the link between Bandung and Belgrade is kind of contested, even in the book that I edited. So look, there's a nice Yugoslav Filmski Novosti film of the 1961 Belgrade summit, attended by 25 states and 3 observers. And they frame this footage in terms of the Belgrade summit being about finding new vistas of hope for an anxious world. And it listed the following questions, and I've put them here, but I'll go through them quickly. The general situation in the world, the establishment and strengthening of international peace and security, respect for the right of nations to self-determination, the struggle against imperialism and the liquidation of colonialism and neo-colonialism, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and non-interference in their internal affairs, racial discrimination and the policy of apartheid, general and complete disarmament, I've lost my list, the banning of nuclear experiments and the maintenance of military bases on foreign territory, peaceful coexistence among states with different social systems, the role and structure of the UN and the application of its resolutions, unequal economic development, and the improvement of international economic and technical cooperation. Missing from the list, of course, is the climate crisis, right? There are other things missing from a contemporary perspective, right? Migration, gender equality, financialization, a whole set of issues. And perhaps this is not surprising, since we're talking about 1961 and there was almost no discussion of the climate crisis outside of rather specialized circles or in terms of single issues. Now, socialist Yugoslavia's motivations for the role it played within NAM were always a mixture of idealism and solidarity, real tangible support for liberation movements. Algeria, for example, on the one hand, and instrumentalism and opportunism on the other, okay? Yugoslavia certainly used NAM to develop new export markets, and its arms sales increased, not only to liberation movements, but to some pretty nasty regimes. What cannot be in doubt is that socialist Yugoslavia was first and foremost a modernizing project, right? It had big M modernization right at its center from the end of the Second World War. And socialist Yugoslavia, I think, brought its own particular stance on modernization into the always already modernizing project of the non-aligned movement. Rapid industrialization and urbanization, the modernization of agricultural production, the harnessing of technological progress, the expansion of education, welfare, and mass literacy. Modernization then, leading to a particular kind of developmentalist and growth trope, was a common denominator across the movement. Now, Yugoslavia and ecology in one paragraph. In a brilliant recent text, my friend and colleague Katarina Kušić has shown through an ethnographic case study of the karst mountains in the Dalmatian hinterland the importance to Yugoslav modernization of conquering and transforming nature. All right? A familiar story. Here, mass displacement of peasants as the karst was flooded for a hydropower dam project was seen as a positive contribution to building a better world. Lenin is in the background here. What was it? I keep misquoting it. Socialism plus electricity equals communism. Katarina's work points to what she terms, quote, ecological and socio-cultural continuities in the ways in which human and non-human life is opened up to exploitation, adding that these also form the basis of resistance and create space for alternatives. Although I think my initial research, people might challenge me on this, and you might well be right, suggests that in socialist Yugoslavia, the few ecological movements of any significance didn't really occur until the 1980s. NAM itself, so you've got NAM as modernizing, right? That's the first bit. The second bit, which is really important for the whole story here, is NAM was very much based on a nation-state logic. You know, every NAM conference, people have the nameplates of the country which they represent. And yet it also modeled, interestingly, a prefigurative form of transnational networking. There was real reluctance to become just another bureaucratic kind of organization at the UN, all right? So that's the second bit, modernization, nation-state logic. The third bit is that there was also something that I want to call non-alignment from below, that never was completely squashed by this non-alignment from above, if you like, or top-down non-alignment. What am I referring to? Transnational networks of cooperation in art, music, architecture, education, and science These went far beyond relations with near neighbors to enrich and enhance international decolonial solidarity on a global scale, right? Students from the Global South studying in Yugoslavia, musicians traveling around, art exhibitions going around the member states of the non-aligned movement, okay? But, and here's the nation-state bit again, NAM still marginalized social forces outside the nation-state, right? I spent the first 10 years of my career in Croatia attacking NGOization and projectization, but it seems 20 years later I actually don't consider NGOs as the enemy anymore. So there were no social forces represented at these NAM events except the liberation movements that were to become future nation states, in a sense, right? Now, as Katarina Kušić reminded me in an email exchange, the point is that those who built the dams in Yugoslavia also built dams in the Global South. So, you know, here's Energo Project boasting of its agreements with Papua New Guinea. So they also globalized or transnationalized the conflicts of nature. Socialist Yugoslavia in Europe, but supportive of the Global South. An ambivalent positionality. Liminal hegemony, I've called it. The Yugoslavs offered direction to the movement, particularly in the first phase. Indeed, most of the communiques were drafted in Belgrade before events took place. Tito sought to de-ideologize NAM. He felt you don't want ideology brought in, which is a weird thing to say, I think, and tried to avoid conflicts between member states. And a part of this was, of course, trying to minimize Cuban influence. Now, although significantly more states, 47 plus 10 observers, attended the Cairo summit in 1964, so you've got 1961 and 1964, Nehru, why do I call him Nero, the Roman Empire? Nehru only came to Belgrade in 1961 because he was reassured that it would be a one-off event, that it wouldn't be a series of events. But there was a follow-up 3 years later in Cairo. But after that, the non-aligned movement really experienced a kind of silencing, a diminution of its role. Yes, it continued to issue condemnations of superpower politics and global insecurity, but it was increasingly marginalized. And yet, even if it had ended, even if it had stopped by 1966, it had also contributed one more thing that was really important, or two more things actually, because without the support from the non-aligned movement in the 1960s, there would not have been UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, under the leadership of the Argentinian economist Raul Prebisch, who will come back in our story later. And even more importantly, perhaps, the first UNCTAD in Geneva led in June 1964 to the establishment of the group of 77 developing countries, the G77, with Yugoslavia as a founding member, and Yugoslavia arguing things like we're one of the more developed of the less developed countries. So it's an interesting, complicated thing. But the important thing is that once you've got NAM, the G77 and UNCTAD, you have a multiplication of the arenas in which global economic inequalities could be discussed. And those arenas were arenas in which the decolonized nations had a voice. All right? Let me go on to the new international economic order, which since I started working on it has now become this year's big thing. All right? In the context of a lowering of political tensions between the two superpowers, a reinvigorated NAM was born at the Lusaka, Zambia summit of September 1970. The hastily arranged summit was a result of close collaboration between the Yugoslavs and a new generation of leaders, notably Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, and Indira Gandhi of India. And they all insisted on the movement becoming much more proactive, no longer being just a talking shop. Nyerere says to Tito, we just produce paper. We need to produce some action, all right? And crucially, in the 70s, NAM focused much more centrally on economic questions, all right? The Lusaka summit included for the first time a declaration on economic progress, and it's obvious when you read that this was an early iteration of the ideas that were to be enshrined in the new international economic order less than 4 years later. Quite radical language. The poverty of developing nations and their economic dependency, quotes, is a structural weakness of the world economic order. The colonial past has led to a neo-colonialism that poses insurmountable difficulties in breaking the shackles of economic dependency. So you've got Prebish, who is not just UNCTAD head, but as an academic economist has been working on dependency theory and trade imbalances between the core and the periphery. You've got Kwame Nkrumah's book on, okay, we have sovereignty, but economic sovereignty we don't have. And you've actually got the Algerian legal scholar Mohamed Badjoui arguing that the entire apparatus of global law is colonial and that we need to scrap it and start again. Okay. 3 years later, NAM has a summit in Algiers in 1973 with another economic declaration. Imperialism is a form of open aggression against the economies of peoples who do not submit to foreign domination. The Algerian text ends up going to the UN General Assembly special meeting that was supposed to be about commodities, but the Algerians insisted on it being much wider. And the new international economic order was adopted without objection on the 1st of May, 1974. So it's 50 years old next year. I'll read that bit. There is an urgency to establish a new order based on equity, sovereign equality, interdependence, common interest, and cooperation among all states, irrespective of their economic and political systems, which shall correct inequalities, redress existing injustices, make it possible to eliminate the widening gap between the developed and the developing countries, and ensure steadily accelerating economic and social development and peace and justice for present and future generations. The oil crisis. OPEC, Gulf states, absolutely crucial. Raised the price of crude oil in 1973, implemented an oil embargo. The United States and its allies were in panic. NAM welcomed OPEC's move, even though NAM had oil exporters and oil importers within its membership, because it saw the possibility that other groups of commodity exporters could act together in a similar way. The new international economic order embedded OPEC's confrontation with the industrial states over oil into a confrontation of the entire third world with the developed states over raw materials and development. What was in it? Well, modernization, certainly. International decision-making. They were against the growing power of the World Bank and the IMF. They were against veto power in the United Nations. Trade, development assistance. It was followed by something that's been forgotten, the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, CERDS, which was adopted on the 12th of December 1974. By now, there were abstentions and voting against, mainly from the Global North, because one bit of CERDS referred to the right of national sovereignty over a nation's wealth, natural resources, and economic activities. Each state has the right to nationalize, expropriate, and transfer ownership of foreign property, in which case appropriate compensation should be paid. And there were legal arguments about what does that mean and which jurisdiction and so on and so forth. A number of non-aligned movement countries, led by the Cubans, had been arguing for some time that you also needed to curb the power of multinational corporations. Okay. Look, the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, still divides commentators today as much as it did at the time. There's some suggestion that it was so radical in its structuralist critique of the global economic order that it was bound to fail because it would be opposed by those with most to lose. There are others who suggest it never amounted to very much in terms of real change, that it was designed to create the conditions for the continued domination of a reformed embedded liberalism. Samir Amin, for example, said this is just the incorporation of the bourgeoisies of the global south into global capitalism. Okay. But I think the articulation of the NIEO was important, not least because of its holistic nature. It brought a number of themes together that had normally been kept separate. And yet, part two, conclusion, the environment is absent, right? Completely absent. Now, not all countries in the developed world opposed the NIEO. I'm doing some work on this at the moment, which even involves me rethinking what the Commonwealth was doing, but I'm not going to talk about that today. But we need to understand that there was this group of like-minded countries, a like-minded group. It was the Nordic neutral states, as well as the Netherlands and Ireland. And now, in some ways, mirroring the role of Yugoslavia within NAM, Sweden sought a global role disproportionate to its size, as an incubator for innovative solutions to global challenges, sympathetic to some of the demands of the global south, and pursuing what some authors have called a humane internationalism. Sweden and the LMG were far more concerned, at least explicitly, than the G77 on NAM with global environmental issues. Not surprisingly, the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth had just been published. The first UN conference on the human environment had been held in Stockholm in June 1972. And Sweden pushed for environmental issues to be more closely linked to some of the core themes of the NIEO, notably resource use, global redistribution, and the need for new forms of developmentalism. I want to get on to the third part, so I'm not going to say too much about the defeat of the NIEO. There are at least two things important here, of course. Thatcher and Reagan, and the United States kind of, beginning to be much more assertive in its opposition to any kind of radical agenda of global economic justice, but also the second oil crisis, which really did pose a problem for those oil importing states in the global south. But, as Getachew has suggested, the NIEO is really important for us today because it was the apex of decolonial world making. It represents the last, until now, serious attempt to channel the United Nations as the means for the creation of an egalitarian global economy. But it didn't do the environment. All right. So here, let me do the last bit for 20 minutes, if I can. Moving to political ecology and the stance of Yugoslavia, the global south, and the UN in the elaboration of environmental concerns in the 1970s. You, I hope, noticed that I'm going to be much more tentative here, and the kind of mode of analysis, the way I get into this, changes. I have more questions than answers here, really. All right, let me bring Branimir onto the stage. A key figure linking socialist Yugoslavia and the global south, both in terms of his work in UNCTAD and the United Nations Environmental Programme, and his academic reflections on global governance, is Branimir Gorcevic. Branimir Gorcevic is 83, and I've managed to find him, and we're in dialogue. So next time I speak, I'll say much more, I think, about some of this. His emphasis on the importance of NAM and the G77 in relation to environmental questions challenged some simplistic assumptions regarding the stance of the global south in relation to questions of the climate crisis and environmental justice. Now, okay, it takes a while. There's a 1992 book, The Quest for World Environmental Cooperation, most of which is about some technical work that he was doing, but it has a really, really good introductory chapter on the north-south tensions before, during, and after the Stockholm Conference of 1972. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the Stockholm Conference, there's a preparation for a NAM foreign ministers meeting in Georgetown, Guyana. And in the archives, I found this memo from the Yugoslav Federal Secretariat for Foreign Affairs a month after Stockholm. And it sums up their immediate reaction. I'll read it. There is a need to address problems regarding the control of the environment, as were expressed recently at the Stockholm Conference on the Environment, and with regards to the recommendations accepted there. especially from the standpoint of increased costs of development that they could bring for developing countries. Stockholm is going to cost more. All right? However, although developing countries are expressing concern regarding the problem of control of the environment, this is still a relatively new thing in the development process and is not of primary importance for them. Instead of this, developed countries, especially through the United Nations system, should pay attention to those matters of immediate importance to developing countries. All right? You've got some speeches at the time which are incredibly interesting, which were just as we're starting to develop a new international economic order, the West has come up with this thing called environmental crisis, as if they haven't got enough things to mess us around with. Okay. Now, Gossovich places this in some context by suggesting that initial concern with the environment was very much framed by the countries of the global north in terms of the need to limit growth, both economic growth and population growth. His observation that the environment became a question of international, even global concern before it had become a question of domestic concern in many countries of the world is quite telling, I think. Of course, the global south was not slow to recognize the hypocrisy of an overdeveloped, affluent, consumerist north, responsible both historically and contemporaneously for the greatest part of the exploitation of natural resources, much of which had been extracted from the global south through colonial relations of violence, now seeking to set limits to the global south's emerging aspirations for development, consequent upon decolonialization. All right? What the Yugoslavs in this memo called the new thing was not seen of prime importance and risked undermining an already fragile development agenda, and indeed could be a new way of perpetuating dependence and underdevelopment. Now, ignore 1973, it was 1972. I got it from a document prepared by the Yugoslavs for the 1989 conference. But the Georgetown meeting of foreign ministers that I just referred to, that memo was a preparation for, said this: the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment served to show the differences in the environmental problems experienced by the rich and the poor countries. The former were irresponsibly created by the industrialized nations, which today try to unload the burden on the international community as a whole. On the other hand, while some of the environmental problems of the third world are inherent to their underdevelopment, others are a legacy of the practices of imperialism in its manifestations of colonialism and neocolonialism, and more recently have been caused by the war waged by imperialism in Indochina, the Middle East and Africa, where chemical and other arms are used for the purpose of destroying the ecology of the territories it hopes to occupy, and in some cases such as that of the Palestinian people, whose populations are displaced from their original homes. Right? So, widening the agenda. Gossovich shows, however, that there was a preparatory meeting for the Stockholm Conference held in Funchal in Switzerland, where an alternative narrative had already begun to emerge, shifting the debate on the environment from a predominant focus on population and conservation, and instead, as this kind of is already suggesting, linking environmental destruction to the same power relations that produce poverty, inequality, underdevelopment, and colonialism, right? The narrative suggested the need for an explicitly politicized approach and not a more technical and specialized approach. A NAM meeting in Kabul the next year, in May 1973, stated, the heads of state and government consider economic backwardness to be the worst kind of pollution. Right? The power of the G77 at this moment, at its height, I would argue, at this moment, led to the decision to situate the UN Environmental Programme in Nairobi, Kenya. An important victory after attempts to situate UNCTAD and UNIDO in the Global South had failed. This reflected a growing concern in the Global South that the Stockholm Conference had been dominated by the concerns of the industrialized countries and their NGOs. As Gossovich points out, however, situating UNEP in Nairobi ended up being something of a Pyrrhic victory for the Global South, because UNEP envisaged as a catalyst and coordinating body within the UN system, which the Americans were already trying to destroy, by the way, experienced staffing problems, and more importantly, only the developed countries could afford to have serious delegations in Nairobi, right? So the bargaining power, the lobbying power of the G77 actually became quite limited, all right? There was another Pyrrhic victory in relation to post-Stockholm negotiations on priorities for the newly established Environmental Fund, all right? A lot of the NIEO was about having commodities funds and some other funds and so on and so forth. The affluent North, the IMF, the World Bank, joined by most of the Soviet bloc countries, by the way, didn't really want this environmental fund. They were really quite anxious about extra budgetary fund. But they also, if it was going to happen, wanted monitoring and information, pollution control, the atmosphere, energy, and global standards to be the priorities. G77 mobilized really quite effectively. They were accused of breaking the spirit of Stockholm, you know, where there was a great consensus. And they stressed instead the importance of funding projects to fight drought, desertification, the use of pesticides, soil erosion, waterborne diseases, location of industry, adaptability of human settlements, and linkages between the environment and economics and trade. Universal standards, they said, had to wait for the elimination of inequalities in terms of trade. So the northern countries kind of limited the power of the Environment Fund. Now, to cut a long story short, the plea expressed in Kabul by the non-aligned movement turned out to be wishful thinking. The additional expenditures involved in programs relating to the environment should not be allowed to prevent the satisfaction of the basic needs of the developing countries. There was a question on basic needs yesterday. I also hate the term, and the World Bank suddenly started getting into basic needs around this time, but it was used in this communique. Any assistance given to developing countries in the domain of the environment should be additional to the assistance which is already being given as development aid. The concern displayed by advanced countries for protecting the environment should not adversely affect the inflow of assistance for development or the trade of developing countries. All right. I'm about 5 minutes behind where I should be, but I do want to bring Rudy Supek into the room. A book written by the Yugoslav sociologist and philosopher Rudy Supek, published in 1973 as Ovo Jedina Zemlja, Our One Earth, which was one of the Stockholm slogans, right? Many activists in ecological movements in Yugoslavia found it inspirational. To my shame, I didn't read it until a month ago. And it's great. So it was written clearly in the aftermath of the Stockholm Conference. It reflected the Club of Rome's work. It was influenced by a number of Anglo-American authors. But it really interestingly lists all of the different elements of an impending ecological crisis that are still relevant today. It marshals a massive amount of evidence on both the need for urgent action and the reasons for inaction. Okay. At the same time, the first third of the book is taken up with neo-Malthusian arguments about population growth and the problems of industrialization and urbanization. So really, he kind of joins in what I would call the panic about population growth in the global south without sufficient acknowledgement of the historical and contemporary nature of colonial, imperial, and racialized exploitation. But it's all rescued by the last part of the book, because the last part of the book contains a clear statement that only utopian socialism, based on new forms of global governance and drastic action to tackle global inequality, can solve the problems. At times, his analysis of global trade is a bit shallow, certainly even when compared to the intellectual thinking behind the NIEO, which he does not refer to, because he is a leading member. Those of you who know my work in the region will know this cheap aside, leading member of the Praxis group of philosophers, promoting a humanistic and extremely Eurocentric reading of Marx. They dismissed late Marx, they concentrated on early Marx. But he's also in there some arguments around small is beautiful, some arguments around organic agriculture. And just a couple of quotes which show, I think, the great relevance of the last bit of the book for looking at degrowth through a decolonial lens today. Freudian slip. The term stable society does not refer to any kind of society desired by the guardians of social order, but refers above all to a society that has established a balance with nature and its own development possibilities, as long as these are understood as purely external or in a material relation with the living environment. I think it should be not purely external. One thing is quite clear. The doctrine of zero growth of the economy or industrialization with regard to the exploitation of natural resources, which today seems more acceptable for understandable reasons even to rich countries, can be adopted by all countries only if they take the point of view of equalizing living conditions for all peoples. Equalizing living conditions for all peoples is a sine qua non of zero growth. Okay, again, because he's a member of Praxis, he pretty much ignores the non-aligned movement. He never cites writers from the global south. And given his condemnation of US hegemony in relation to the ecocide of the Vietnam War and his condemnation of nuclear weapons, it would have been interesting, to say the least, for his work to connect with NAM's work in relation to disarmament. No less important would be to situate Supek in dialogue with those Yugoslav feminists currently being researched by my good friend Chiara Bonfiglioli, such as Vida Tomšić and Nevenka Petric. These were women whose internationalism forged strong links with women activists and policy advocates in the global south, and who, in their own long march through global institutions such as the International Planned Parenthood Federation, worked tirelessly against neo-Malthusianism in theory, policy, and practice. Okay? So I think, looking at these links, looking at these decolonial networks of solidarity, looking at these alternative intellectual, theoretical, conceptual, and practical positions is the way to go. But I'm going to end with something else. 3 minutes, if I may. Okay. Historians don't do this, but I will. What-ifism. If we can trace, and I think we can, an embryonic decolonial politics of ecological justice in the 1970s, in which NAM played an important role, that was stopped in its tracks by the rollback and rollout insurgent neoliberalism of Thatcherism and Reaganism, that so abruptly put an end to ideas of a new international economic order. Can we also think about what ecological justice might have looked like in a different what-if world? Of course, the decolonial environmentalism was more often implicit than explicit. It was fraught with contradictions. It was fragile and it was unstable. But there are some elements that I think we need to think about. Firstly, NAM's concern with general and complete disarmament. It combined direct opposition to the proliferation of nuclear weapons and mutually assured destruction with a much wider concern regarding the environmental impacts of nuclear proliferation and testing. Okay? Secondly, there was a real focus within NAM on the preservation of the marine environment, biodiversity of the sea. Part of this was linked to concerns about national jurisdictions and the law of the sea, which are very technical and I'm only just beginning to get into. Some of you may know much more about this than me. So that's the second one. The third one is within NIEO and Kurds, a focus on control of natural resources. Now, of course, at the time, most of this was about the right of these newly decolonized nation states to control and exploit these resources. But I think it's not too much of a stretch to envisage that this could have extended over time to concerns regarding the limits of this exploitation in the context of growing awareness of planetary boundaries. Nationalization of lithium mines today, anybody? Okay. And finally, NAM led the way in terms of wanting curbs over the power of multinational corporations. And again, concern over their power to destroy ecosystems may well have gained importance in time as one part of self-determination and collective self-reliance. Of course, what-ifism needs to be combined with we will never know-ism, okay? Perhaps the nature of NAM as a modernizing, industrializing project would have continued to relegate ecological issues to the margins, even without the scourge of global neoliberalism and structural adjustment. The failure of NAM member states to involve their own non-state and indigenous actors in any kind of dialogue may have proved even more damaging for the cause of environmental justice in the long run. We will never know. Final paragraph. What is certain is that as a number of commentators, and they're growing by the day, call for a new non-aligned movement and a new international economic order, which includes environmental justice as central, the real problem for me, I think, is the disconnect between the what, the who, and the how. The BRICS countries, right, and BRICS is about to expand in number, double in size, including Saudi Arabia. The BRICS countries may have the economic clout to challenge US imperial hegemony, but perhaps they lack, and I already in an email exchange got kind of a bit of concern about this term, perhaps they lack the moral authority that the non-aligned movement at certain times had. Tito used that phrase a lot, you know, perhaps it's ethical authority, I don't know. But, you know, the BRICS countries include Russia and India, just so that we're clear. Okay. Real and meaningful global redistribution, global taxation for global post-development financing, global economic rights, new green eco-social policies, a genuine internationalization of welfare are themes that I think remain legacies of the work that NAM, the G77 and others did, particularly in the 1970s. In that sense, more analysis of the period and more attempts to learn lessons for the current conjuncture are certainly needed. This might help us in understanding the world, but it is social forces that will change it, of course. Thank you. This is written and my email is there, so you can have it if you want.
Sorry, thank you, Paul, for a wonderful lecture. We have some issue with portable mic. So we have some 10 minutes left if you want to ask some question. And as I said at the beginning, Paul has a new book on the topic, so you can learn even more from the book. But now you have a unique opportunity to ask him a question or two if you have one. And when you're asking question, just please say your name and affiliation and then ask a question. So the first one. The volunteer has a microphone, and we will try to manage this way.
Good morning, Paul. Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. My name is Ana Margarida Esteves. I'm a research fellow at the Center for International Studies of the University Institute of Lisbon, Portugal. And I was quite struck and challenged by your concluding sentence saying that one of the major obstacles for the formation of a new non-aligned internationalism might be the lack of ethic authority from the part of many countries that are part of the BRICS,
yeah.
including, Mr. Putin's Russia and Mr. Narendra Modi's India. My question is, to what extent aren't the politics of Mr. Putin and Mr. Narendra Modi's, as well as of other leaders of non-aligned countries, namely in the Emirates and the Gulf states, the results of a geopolitical strategy from the part of United States, with the purpose of undermining the very ethical principles on which the United Nations were originally formed.
Yes.
I remember some years ago hearing from a Lululemon wearing yoga practitioner that, Narendra Modi, yes, is quite radical. He's even fomenting the murder of the Muslim minority, but he promotes yoga. And I wonder, to what extent isn't this part of a kind of soft power-based geopolitics based on cultural influence. And for that analysis, I very strongly recommend the book Aztlan America and the Religion of No Religion by Jeffrey Kripal, which has a whole chapter on that topic.
Thank you.
With the purpose of, promoting the so-called me generation based on New Age ideas.
Sorry to
Thanks.
interrupt you, but we have some other questions in the public, so.
Hello. Hi, Paul. My name is Alexander Matkovic from the Institute of Economic Sciences in Belgrade, and I just want to thank Paul for his lovely lecture. So thank you, Paul. I have actually just a couple of short questions. I won't take too long. So I work on Marxist education in Yugoslavia, and for the last 5 years I've been doing archival research, which has basically uncovered that in the network of over 200 Marxist centers in Yugoslavia, they did debate degrowth in 1977. They did debate the limits to growth. Why? Of course, because that debate has, via Rudi Supek, which you mentioned, who was actually present and involved in the Club of Rome report, basically, they have been debating how self-management can solve the limits to growth. And even Edward Kardelj, one of the architects of self-management, was himself delivering a speech at one of the actually one of the main ecological protection society in Belgrade. I think it was 1979 or 1978. Basically, shortly before his death, he expressed the idea that self-management can contribute to solving the limits to growth issue. And I think some of the things we had in Yugoslavia could be, not to be over enthusiastic, of course, but I think, limiting throughput by breaking up monopolies or lowering the amount of payment that CEOs, can get, and even introducing workers' councils to regulate production kind of goes into a different direction than profit-oriented production. So that was like, just for food for thought. And regarding the non-aligned movement, well, taking the cue from your lecture, I'm wondering to what extent did they had any choice actually, except for going into progressivism, because I think we would have done the same, to be honest. If you would ask a degrowth conference, what the South should do, the most basic a reply you would get is the South needs to grow, right? And I think after colonialism, that might have been the only option. So my question is, to what extent do you think they could have actually had a choice to make a different move, or was this necessary? And, just to get the elephant in the room, out of the closet. So what do you think about BRICS today? That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Paul will now answer the questions, and then we will, if we will have time, get another one.
So I'll be really quick. It's why I should not have had the final paragraph, because the book that I'm writing on the new international economic order, the last chapter will be on BRICS. All I was trying to do, though, was to argue that actually it is not so straightforward, and I think that's the point you're making. But it will be extraordinarily interesting, because there was a question about China yesterday, and I think China's role in all of this. And we don't even need, I did it in one moment in the lecture, and it's a problematic thing when you start to talk about motivations for geopolitics, in a way, because, however idealistic you are, geopolitics is real politics as well, right? So how far China will kind of, how do I phrase this in ways that don't dig a hole and put me deeper in it? In a sense, early Chinese developmentalism was quite neo-colonialist, but I think now there's an attempt to kind of be aware of a much broader participatory thing. So I think, I wouldn't rule out BRICS, but I would not simplistically say BRICS is the origins of a new non-aligned movement that can do the same kind of thing. And I think we're on the same line there. Sasha, thanks. I mean, this is the reason we've agreed to go for coffee straight after this. I actually, I was making a joke to someone yesterday that I end with 1979 because for me that's Reagan and Thatcher and the end of the world. And I kind of, need to look at the 80s. But actually you telling me that there were these debates in 1977 is really important. I wrote something else about Supek doing some work for UNESCO on participation, where he did bring in self-management. And I think the lecture yesterday on degrowth communism connects with this, because you can see the later phase of self-management, particularly self-organized, self-managed communities of interest, moving away from factory-based self-management to community-based self-management as something that could actually be quite useful. But the Yugoslavs were really quite reluctant to sell self-management to the global south, because every state has to determine their own interests, right? But what there was a faith in planning, a belief in planning. So I think that kind of fits. Yeah, I mean, they're not the brick. What do I think about the bricks? I'm trying to answer it clumsily. Was there a choice? In an earlier draft of this, and somebody criticized me for it, I wrote something about other paths to modernity. You know, and I think that maybe relates to agriculture, and Supek talks a lot about this. What kind of agricultural development do you have to do? What's the relationship between the rural and the urban? You know, there were other alternatives, in a sense, around that. Maybe if non-aligned states had brought their own non-state actors in, indigenous peoples in, might have been different. But I understand. I mean, I absolutely, and certainly the 60s, and certainly the first wave, you know, this is going, just as we've got on the agenda the NIEO, you're now changing the rules of the game.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We have time for one really quick question, so one short one. Okay.
You can come here if you want.
Yes, thank you. Remco, from the People's Health Movement, working with the Center for Planetary Health Policy. Can you say something about the European Union? We're in the European Union at the moment. We talked yesterday about the geopolitics of degrowth. Can you say something about, is there some alignment possible or not in your consideration at this moment vis-a-vis a new Green Deal, etc.?
Do you want me to respond as the historian of the 70s or the reluctant? No. I mean, look. I will respond in two conjunctures, right? What strikes me around the non-aligned movement in the Global South and the European Union is that at the start they recognize it for what it was, which is what Petrich would call a classic protectionist Global North club, right? So Petrich, Prebisch wanted no protectionism. So he's a liberal Marxist, right? But if there's going to be protectionism, it should be protectionism of the Global South, not protectionism of the rich North, right? So there was a real awareness, actually, of that. However, end of the 70s, you get the Helsinki process. You get a bit of a different understanding of the European space. And the non-aligned movement and the Yugoslavs wanted the European Union to acknowledge its colonial past and to support the new international economic order. There's a lovely British-UK trade memo. We can understand why these bloody Scandinavians are supporting the Global South, but what is the Netherlands doing supporting this? You know, how on earth can a core capitalist country in Europe be supporting this nonsense, right? And the only reason I'm answering like this is because, you know, I spent 20 years of my life writing reports for the European Commission because I believed that there might be a kind of progressive sense of social policy, and now a progressive sense of eco-social policy. It's a neoliberal bloody club in which these things are marginal, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't use the long march and try and develop and change things. But I really don't see the Green New Deal as decolonial.
Okay,
Now
thank
I'll
you,
just
Paul.
provoke more questions.
Thank you, Paul. This is all the time that we have for today.